Welcome to the Tilted Halo. This is a new podcast, and it's for anybody who's a woman in ministry. You might be a pastor like myself, a bishop, a priest, a rabbi, music minister, elder, children's minister, whatever your title is. You're absolutely in the right place, especially if you're someone who loves your ministry and you're doing it well and you're feeling pressure to sometimes be perfect, and deep down inside, you know you're not. And how in the world to deal with that? And men, you're absolutely welcome here too, because this is about ministry and the same thing can happen to you. So you're all in the right place. Let's get started with the show. Have you ever served in a congregation where the previous pastor, faith leader of some degree, kept coming back? Now, maybe that's okay with you. Maybe that's part of the tradition in your faith tradition. Yeah, that may be true. Maybe you have somebody who's a pastor emeritus, who's a member of the congregation. Great. But what if that pastor keeps kind of sticking his or her nose into what you're doing and talks to people about, oh, I wouldn't do it that way? Oh boy, then things can get pretty darn rough. Let me share an experience that I had. It was, it's no secret of an experience that made the newspapers, not for me personally, but for what was happening in the congregation. My husband and I were serving a congregation. We'd been there about 2 years, and the spouse of a member passed away quite unexpectedly. And I think he was in his early 40s, maybe, still had 2 children at home under the age of 20, or I think the oldest may have been about 20 in age. And the man who passed away was not technically a member, but his wife had been a lifelong member of that congregation. Her parents were members, aunts and uncles were members of the congregation. So she was very much a part of the congregation. The congregation has a church cemetery, which is fairly common in certain parts of the country for a congregation of any Christian background to have their own cemetery, and it's usually right next to the church building. And that was the case at this church. And the policy for that church cemetery was that anybody who was a member would have free burial space in the cemetery. The same was true of the spouse of a member, if that spouse was not a member of the congregation. So that meant that this gentleman who had passed away was entitled to free burial in the church cemetery. And what would happen at the time of a death is a member of the cemetery committee would meet with somebody from the family and go and show them where there were available spaces. Now, some people had, in a sense, kind of reserved a space. Nobody owned spaces in the church cemetery. The church never sold any of that property so that nobody ever had a deed or had ownership of that's a space. But there were times and were families who had said, this is where I'd like to be buried. And so in this case, the widow's parents had space set aside. And in fact, I believe the widow's father had already died at this point in time, not that long before her husband died. And so the parents were buried in one row, and there was in the row below that looked like, according to the records that the representative from the church cemetery had, that there were some spaces available. And they were listed as unassigned. So that's where the burial for this widow's husband was done, in one of those spaces. And the next space was reserved or assigned to her. And since she still had 2 children at home, another 2 spaces were assigned for them. And the burial took place, and everything seemed to be normal. That happened in September. But in December, we began hearing some rumblings that there was a member of the congregation who was quite upset with where this person had been buried, claiming that that was his family's plot, that space and the other spaces assigned to this widow and her children were part of his family's plot. There was nothing in the records to indicate that. Yes, the upset members' brother and parents were buried in the row above where this person, was buried in an adjacent row to where the deceased member, the deceased spouse, had been buried. But there was nothing in the records to indicate that the spaces in question had been assigned to this man's family in perpetuity. Well, it got messy. And the unhappy member actually filed a lawsuit suing the congregation and the widow for where her husband was buried, and demanding that his remains be removed at their expense, or at her expense, I should say. And in the midst of all of this, the pastor who had preceded my husband and myself was contacted by the unhappy member who had filed this lawsuit, and it went into arbitration before anything else happened. And this former pastor gave a deposition in favor of the unhappy member who claimed that these spaces were part of his family plot, even though the bylaws of the church cemetery indicated there were no family plots, indicated that coping, and there was some coping there, meant absolutely nothing. The bylaws were clear on that. But the former pastor gave a deposition in favor of the plaintiff in this lawsuit. Things were not good. And people who loved the former pastor sided with the former pastor and this plaintiff. And there were other people who understood the bylaws of the church cemetery and sided with the widow and the church cemetery committee and the church council, which wanted to resolve this, peacefully in some way, manner, shape, or form. When the ruling of the arbitrator came down, the arbitrator said, let the deceased lie in peace. It was not binding arbitration, so the plaintiff then proceeded with the lawsuit. And the deposition from the former pastor was entered into the record as part of the lawsuit. Now, this was not the only way in which this former pastor had kept in contact with and was being a part of things in that congregation in a way that was not exactly helpful. He had also continued to visit certain special members that people that he and his family really loved. And those people did not want me or my husband coming to visit. So we could not really be the pastors to some of these other people because the former pastor kept being involved there. And he was not the kind of person to tell people to, I've retired, I'm gone. You need to go talk to the current pastors. He didn't do that. And that got to be very divisive within the congregation. It got to be something that created a lot of hard feelings, not only with this lawsuit, but with other seemingly smaller things, but really important things, like who was visiting whom, and if there was a baptism, who would do the baptism? If there was a wedding, was he going to be the one doing a wedding for someone? And he did, at least for one. So that previous pastor's continued involvement really hindered the ability for people to grieve his leaving that congregation because he kept coming back. And so it limited their ability to move on, to form a new attachment with myself and my husband, and who knows further down the road. So whenever you leave a congregation, the best thing to do is to completely leave. Yes, you have so many attachments. Yes, you've learned to love the people, and some of them you get close to more than others. When I retired, I had the same feelings. There are people who I dearly miss. I keep wondering, how are they doing? What's going on? Who are they? It's okay to maybe share a Christmas card or something like that with people, but not to be involved in their pastoral care. That's a totally different ballgame. And it's hard for people to understand that because as pastors and in that kind of a setting, we have the privilege of entering into major life events with people. Birth, baptism, if you practice confirmation or first communion, whatever that is, weddings, surgeries, illnesses, death. Those are critical times within people's lives, very important times. And once somebody starts to welcome us in, they don't really willingly kick us out, even when we leave, whether it's for another position or to retire. It is far better for us to say, I love you, enough to say, you need to welcome the new pastor. You need to let him or her, especially if it's a woman, become your pastor now. Trust that person. Welcome that new pastor. Because if we keep going back to people and getting involved with people where we have left, that indicates that we're hanging on. We're hanging on to relationships that are precious, yes, that are important to us, yes, but they're not ours to hang on to. That's not what we're called there to be. Then they're feeding our needs for identity, our needs for purpose. And that's not what they're there for. We're there to minister to them. They're not there to give us meaning, to give us purpose, to be our friends. Would be nice if we could be friends with every member in the congregation, or even with some of them. But there will come a day where we leave that congregation, and it becomes very difficult to have friendships within the congregation, in part because we can't be friends the same way with everybody. And if you're friends and special friends with one, but not with someone else, that gets to be a problem. Why not me when you do it with them? And the trust relationship is not built as easily, and it comes apart quicker when we do those kinds of things. It's great to have close relationships with people, to share those wonderful special times with people, to be there as much as a friend as we can be, but it is hard. And we need to let someone new take that place. I've sometimes talked about it kind of like being a doctor, a physician. If you've ever had a physician who's retired, you know, or maybe moved to a different practice or something like that, you know that you can't keep going back to that physician and saying, you know, you're retired, but I want you to still be my doctor. You still got to treat me. That would not work. That would not work if you want to stay a patient in a particular practice, but the physician has moved to a different practice. You can't do both. You'd have to move all of your medical records or whatever to where this new physician is, even if that means moving several miles out of town to a different city or whatever it may be. So we can't expect anything different from our pastors. And as a pastor, we need to be as clear about those boundaries. And it is an issue of boundaries. We need to be as clear about those boundaries of what happens when we leave. We need to leave. And that is one of the hardest things about ministry. Yeah, it's tough. It's tough to leave the people we love. It's tough to leave the kinds of situations where we've watched someone grow up and seen them blossom into a beautiful person. It's tough to leave those situations when we know somebody is ill and fighting and having trouble. It's tough to leave. But you give a gift to people, to the members of that congregation, that ministry place, when you do completely leave and tell them, I cannot be your pastor anymore. You need to talk to the new pastor. You need to talk to the one who's the interim pastor, whatever that may be, to align themselves with what's coming next. It's important for their growth. It's also important for yours. So think about that the next time somebody calls you from a former congregation and says, hey, pastor, would you come back and do the wedding for me or for somebody? Or would you come and be part of the funeral? Think about that. You can be there as a friend. You can be there as somebody who wishes them well. But please remember, you're not their pastor anymore. That's okay. it's time for them to love and be loved by a new pastor. So don't meddle. You'll get yourself into a heck of a lot of trouble. You'll make it very difficult for the new pastor. And most of all, you're really hurting the people you say you love. So think about that. And then come back again next week for another show. Until then, God's peace. You have been listening to Tilted Halo with me, Kathleen Panning. What did you think about this episode? I'd really like to hear from you. Leave me some comments. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share this episode. And catch another upcoming episode for more conversation on ministry, life, mindset, and a whole lot more. Go to www.tiltedhalohelp.com, where I've got a resource guide and other resources waiting for you. And be sure to say hi to me, Kathleen Panning, on LinkedIn. See you on the next episode.